The plastic bottle in your hand will outlive you, probably your grandchildren. And it exists because in 1863, a New York billiard manufacturer offered $10,000 to whoever could save the elephants. The substance that today chokes the oceans was invented and sold as a way to rescue wildlife. The two things you just heard are both true, and the distance between them is the entire history of the modern world. In the middle of the 19th century, billiards was a sport for gentlemen and a business for the men who sold them their tables. Green felt, brass-trimmed cues and ivory balls that clicked against each other in the gaslight of rooms the public was not invited into. A good set of balls was a status object. A chipped or cracked ball was a humiliation. The expectation was that a gentleman's billiard room would be restocked regularly, that the ivory would be fresh, and that the click of the cue against the object ball would carry the particular bright tone that only new ivory could give. The game was spreading. Private billiard rooms were a mark of a well-appointed house. Public billiard halls were opening in cities across America. The sport needed more ivory than it had ever needed before. A single high-grade billiard ball required a piece of tusk with a particular grain and a particular density. Workmen in the trade said a single tusk would yield only a handful of balls. The demand was insatiable and the source was finite. Between 1840 and 1875, British imports of ivory rose from around 200,000 pounds a year to more than 800,000. Historians estimate that volume was killing several thousand elephants a year across the broader trade. Tusks grew scarcer. Tusks grew expensive. The African elephant population in 1800 has been estimated at between 10 and 20 million. By the end of the 20th century, it was under a million. That collapse happened for many reasons over many decades, but the curve that started in the 1840s was one of its earliest inflections. The billiard trade was not the largest driver. It did not need to be. It only needed to be one more pressure on a system that was already under strain. In New York, Michael Phelan watched this market squeeze his industry from two directions at once. Phelan, known as the father of American billiards, had won the first national billiards championship in 1859. He had published the sport's first American instruction book. He ran with his partner Hugh Colander, the dominant billiard table manufacturer in the country. Both motivations were real, and, at that moment, indistinguishable. The price of ivory was a threat to his business. The disappearance of elephants was, by then, a visible problem on the page of any newspaper that cared to look. Phelan had retired from competitive play the same year he placed the advertisement. He had been the face of American billiards for almost 2 decades, the man who had pulled the game out of the back room and put it on the public stage. Now, he was using that visibility to chase a problem the trade could not solve on its own. The prize was not just an advertisement. It was a public act from a man whose name still opened doors. In 1863, Phelan and Colander placed the notice. They offered $10,000, a fortune at the time, roughly $200,000 in today's money, to anyone who could produce a substitute for ivory that would work in a billiard ball. $10,000 to whoever could save the elephants, or save the industry, or both. The wording did not draw a fine line between them. No one in that decade would have seen a difference. A young printer in Albany, New York, answered the advertisement. John Wesley Hyatt was 26 years old. He had grown up in Starkey, in the Finger Lakes region, and had been setting type since he was 16. He had no chemistry training. He had no degree of any kind. He had an attic workshop, a stubborn streak, and the kind of patience that survives being told, politely, by working chemists that the problem was insoluble. What Hyatt did have was a problem the right size for a man like him. The prize had been out for 2 years. The big firms had tried. Nothing had stuck. He started with what printers knew. He mixed shellac, a resin secreted by the lac beetle and used to seal everything from wooden furniture to electrical equipment, with bone dust and ivory dust, and pressed the paste into molds. He patented that composite in 1865, but the result was only a partial substitute, and he knew it, so he kept going. Around the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, an English metallurgist named Alexander Parkes had been working on a similar problem. Parkes exhibited a nitrocellulose-based material he called Parkesine at the Great Exhibition in London in 1862, 4 years before Hyatt had filed anything. Parkes's company failed for lack of capital, not lack of chemistry. The formula crossed the ocean in fragments, through publications and conversations, and the small migrations of trade knowledge. In 1884, a federal judge in New York would rule that Parkes was the true inventor of the underlying process, and that the Hyatts had commercialized it. The American origin story of plastic would have to make room for the English one. Back in Albany, Hyatt began working with collodion, a syrupy solution of nitrocellulose already used in photography and in surgical dressings. He tried various solvents. Then he tried camphor, a waxy substance drawn from the camphor laurel, and he tried mixing the two under heat and pressure. The nitrocellulose softened. The camphor made it moldable. The mixture set hard when it cooled and could be remelted and remolded again. In 1870, Hyatt and his brother Isaiah patented the process. Isaiah called the material celluloid. The Hyatt brothers had not invented plastic. They had made it work. The material worked, but it was not gentle. Nitrocellulose is, at bottom, the basis of many explosives, and celluloid inherited a temperament. The Albany factory burned. It burned again. Hyatt's workers had to be careful around loose material because the dust could ignite. For a while, billiard balls made of celluloid could, in the wrong circumstances, do more than click. The prize committee never paid the $10,000, by the way. The celluloid ball was deemed too flammable to put in a public billiard hall. None of this slowed the brothers down. The factory was rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. Celluloid did not stop at billiard balls. That turned out to be the smallest part of the story. Once you had a material that could be heated, poured into a mold, and hardened into any shape you wanted, the world opened up. Celluloid replaced ivory in piano keys and cutlery handles. It replaced tortoiseshell in combs and hairpins. It replaced horn in spectacle frames. It replaced bone and coral and mother of pearl in buttons and jewelry, and the small decorative objects that filled Victorian parlors. By the 1880s, celluloid was being molded into dolls that did not shatter, into knife handles that did not crack, into the white collars and gleaming cuffs that distinguished a clerk from a laborer. The Victorian parlor, the Victorian office, and the Victorian nursery were being quietly restocked in plastic. The trade names tell the story in a single word. Manufacturers sold celluloid as ivory, as ivoire, as French ivory, as Parisian ivory, as grained ivory, ivory without the ivory, tortoise without the tortoise. The product was not hiding what it had replaced. It was selling the substitution. And in 1878, the Celluloid Manufacturing Company of Newark, New Jersey, where the brothers had moved production, put the logic of the substitution into writing. A sales pamphlet circulated to wholesalers and retailers that year contained this sentence, and the sentence is worth hearing twice. As petroleum came to the relief of the whale, so has celluloid given the elephant, the tortoise, and the coral insect a respite in their native haunts. And it will no longer be necessary to ransack the earth in pursuit of substances which are constantly growing scarcer. That is the founding statement of the plastics age, written in the founder's own hand. Petroleum had replaced whale oil and saved the whales from the harpoon. Celluloid would replace ivory and horn and tortoiseshell and save the animals that carried them. The conservationist pitch was not a modern reading, it was the original marketing. A man in a Newark showroom, holding up a celluloid comb in 1878, was telling his customer, in good faith, that the comb in his hand was the reason a hawksbill turtle had swum away that year unharmed. The claim was sincere. It was also, by the measures available at the time, working. By the late 19th century, the hawksbill sea turtle had already been hunted for its shell for centuries, and the trade was accelerating. Celluloid and the petrochemical plastics that followed would eventually take enough pressure off that the hawksbill population might have recovered. That it has not is the second half of the story, and we will get to it. Celluloid was the first material in human history that was cheap, moldable, and effectively immortal. It did not rot. It did not corrode. It did not need to be coaxed out of an animal or mined out of a hillside. It was made in a factory from cotton and camphor, and a process any chemist could repeat. The very properties that made it a miracle for Victorian conservation were the properties that would, a century later, make it a catastrophe for the modern ocean. And almost no one saw the second part coming, because almost no one imagined the first part scaling the way it did. In 1880, a young bank clerk from Rochester, New York, named George Eastman, who had been experimenting with ways to make photography portable, walked into the Hyatt brothers' Newark office with an unusual request. Glass plates were heavy and fragile and required a darkroom on the spot. Eastman needed a flexible substrate for film that could be loaded into a small box and operated by anyone. He asked the celluloid makers if they could help. They could. Eastman's chemist, a man named Henry Reichenbach, refined the formula, mixing celluloid with amyl acetate to create a thin, flexible, transparent film that could be wound on a roll. The Kodak roll film camera launched in 1888. The camera came preloaded with film for 100 exposures. When the film was spent, the customer sent the whole camera back to Kodak, which developed the pictures and returned the camera reloaded. The technology was so simple that the instruction manual could fit on a single sheet. The slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." It was the first consumer technology that asked nothing of the buyer except the price of admission and a steady hand. Suddenly, anyone could take a photograph. A girl on a bicycle, a father at a picnic, a stranger on a city street. The number of photographs taken in the world did not grow by a multiple. It grew by a category change. Within a generation, the family album would become a feature of every middle-class home on Earth. Eastman was the most consequential of the unintended users, but he was not the only one. In the late 1870s, the celluloid manufacturing company began marketing celluloid collars and cuffs to white-collar workers. The product promised a clean collar every day without laundering, and the company's own trade cards made the pitch in the bluntest possible terms. The cards depicted caricatured Chinese laundries and openly framed the product as putting them out of business. Celluloid had found its way into the everyday costume of the modern city, and it had done so by promising to free people from work that was, in the company's own view, beneath them. The miracle was scaling. The curse for the moment was waiting. The double turn when it came was not that the material betrayed its promise. It was that the material kept its promise so well that the promise changed the world. Celluloid, and the generations of plastics that followed it, did reduce the demand for ivory and tortoiseshell and whalebone and horn. That part is not in dispute. Conservation organizations today treat the hawksbill turtle as critically endangered because a century of industrial tortoiseshell trade had already nearly wiped it out, and celluloid is part of what slowed that trade down. The plastic comb on a Victorian dressing table was, in its own small way, a life spared. But the property that spared those lives was the property that could not be undone. The material did not biodegrade. It did not rust. It did not give way. The comb that spared the turtle in 1880 outlived the turtle, and the bottle, and the dresser, and the house it sat in. Today, more than 400 million tons of plastic are produced every year. Around 9% of it is recycled. The rest is landfilled, incinerated, or lost to the environment, where it breaks down very slowly into microplastics that have been detected in human blood and tissues in countries around the world. Around 11 million tons enter the ocean in a single year. The very indestructibility that was the miracle is the indestructibility that is the problem. The solution did not fail. The solution succeeded into the problem. The thing that was supposed to liberate nature from human appetite became the new appetite that human beings could not satisfy or digest or outlive. Plastic did not break its conservationist promise. It kept it. And the keeping is what broke everything else. A man named Hyatt, working in an attic in Albany in the 1860s, took a $10,000 prize meant to save the elephants and handed the world the material that would replace them. The conservationist pitch on the pamphlet was sincere. The whitening of Victorian parlors with celluloid was a real reduction in animal suffering, and the same molecular stubbornness that spared a tortoise in 1878 is the reason a sea turtle today is more likely to eat a plastic bag than to be made into one. The guilt you feel holding a plastic bottle and the gratitude a Victorian conservationist felt holding the same kind of material are the same feeling, separated by 150 years. What changed was not the plastic. It was the scale and what the scale revealed. What everyday object do you wish had a more honest origin story? Drop it in the comments and subscribe to The Origin Portal for one a day.